Rule number 1, never lose money. Rule number 2, never forget. Rule number 1. I've repeated this sentence for decades, not because it's sophisticated, but because it's uncomfortably simple, and simple things are often ignored, especially when money is involved. Over the course of my life, I've noticed that most people believe the wealthy know some hidden secret, a trick, a shortcut, some privileged information. In my experience, what actually exists are not secrets, but silent rules. Rules of behavior that almost no one teaches because they seem too obvious to those who already live by them. I learned early that conversations about money usually turn into lessons, lectures, or promises. I've never liked that, because money, in the end, responds far less to intelligence than it does to behavior. I've seen very capable people struggle because of repeated decisions, and I've seen ordinary people do well simply because they avoided predictable mistakes. It wasn't brilliance, it was posture, respect for time, the ability not to turn every decision into a test of nerves. Throughout my life, I've noticed a curious pattern. People ask, "What should I do?" when the more important question is almost always, "What should I avoid?" There's a huge difference between making money and not losing it. That difference rarely shows up in exciting conversations because it doesn't impress. It doesn't make for great stories. But it builds results, and sustainable results almost always come from what you choose not to do when everyone else is doing it. When I say there are rules that are never taught, I'm not talking about anything conspiratorial. It's simpler than that. They aren't taught because they don't look glamorous. They don't promise fast change. They don't fit neatly into headlines. They're rules that demand patience in a world that rewards speed. And patience has never been an easy thing to sell. I learned early that human beings are remarkably intelligent when they need to justify a bad decision. I say that kindly because I've done it myself many times. Over my experience, I've noticed how creative the mind becomes when it wants to turn impulse into a plan. The decision is already made. Logic shows up afterward just to make everything feel more comfortable. It's not a lack of character, it's human behavior. There's a silent rule that almost no one spells out. The person who keeps emotional control has an advantage over the person who reacts to everything. That doesn't mean being cold. It means recognizing your impulse and not obeying it immediately. Over the decades, I've seen people lose peace of mind and money, not because of major mistakes, but because of small reactions repeated over and over, reactions to comparison, to other people's stories, to the subtle promise that now is the moment. People say they want to think long-term, but they live as if every week were decisive. They say they trust time, but they check results with constant anxiety. There's a quiet humor in that if you step back and observe. It's like planting a tree and coming back every day to see if it grew overnight. It didn't, and it won't grow faster just because you're watching. Over my life, I've learned that one of the most ignored rules is knowing when not to act. That sounds strange to people who were taught that movement always means progress. But very often, the biggest mistake is confusing activity with advancement. Staying still at certain moments is an active choice. It's a way to protect what you've already built. The problem is that no one applauds patience. People applaud movement, even when that movement makes no sense. There's also a silent rule about comparison. Comparing yourself to others is human, but making decisions based on comparison is expensive. When someone decides because everyone else is doing it, they hand control of their life over to collective mood, and collective mood changes quickly. Over the decades, I've seen this movie so many times that it stopped being surprising. The names change, the context changes, the behavior stays the same. I learned early that the person who can say, "I don't know," avoids many obvious mistakes. The problem is that "I don't know" sounds weak in a world that values certainty. But absolute certainty is often dangerous. People who believe too strongly in quick answers usually ignore important questions. And ignored questions come back later, charging emotional interest. There's a rule that never shows up in conversations about wealth. Protecting your peace of mind is part of the process. Decisions made under pressure are rarely good decisions. Stress doesn't improve judgment, it narrows it. Over my experience, I've noticed that clarity almost always appears after urgency fades. The problem is that many people decide before that happens. If this is making sense so far, check the pinned comment later. I left something there that connects all of this. In this first part, I wanted to open space for reflection, not to list rules like commandments, but to show that what separates people who build something solid from those who are always chasing is rarely advanced knowledge. It's basic behavior, repeated patiently. In the next part, I want to go deeper into how these silent rules appear in everyday life, why most people ignore them even knowing the risk, and how small shifts in posture can prevent mistakes that repeat for years. Over my life, I've learned that the most important rules are rarely presented as rules. They show up disguised as habits, as small decisions, as choices that seem insignificant day to day. That's why so many people spend their entire lives hearing about money and still trip over the same issues. It's not lack of information, it's excess of automatic behavior. One of these silent rules is understanding that money responds better to consistency than to intensity. I see many people waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect decision, the perfect turning point. Meanwhile, they ignore small, repeated decisions that over time make all the difference. Over the decades, I've observed that people who build something solid rarely make spectacular moves. They make predictable ones. And predictability, while unexciting, is extremely powerful. There's also the rule of accepting that discomfort is part of the process. Many people believe they're doing something wrong because they feel insecure, anxious, or uncertain. In my experience, those feelings don't necessarily mean error. Often, they simply mean you're not obeying your natural impulse. The problem is that we've been trained to escape discomfort as quickly as possible. And when we do that, we always return to the same patterns. Throughout my life, I've noticed that human beings have a strange relationship with time. They underestimate it at the beginning and overestimate it while waiting for results. They want fast results, but they also get tired quickly. This creates a strange cycle. Rushed decisions followed by equally rushed abandonment, and that cycle is expensive. Not because every decision is disastrous, but because none of them are given time to mature. Another rarely taught rule is learning to separate movement from progress. People feel productive when they're busy, when they're doing something, anything, but not every movement moves you forward. Some just spin in circles. Over the decades, I've seen many people confuse activity with advancement and end up exhausted, frustrated, and in the same place. There's also a silent rule about expectations. People who expect everything to work without frustration usually quit too early. People who understand that the path includes boredom, doubt, and long stretches without novelty tend to endure. There's a subtle humor in that. People say they want stability, but they get bored quickly when nothing exciting happens. Yet, stability almost always feels boring while it's being built. I learned early that comparing results without comparing processes is a common trap. People look at where someone ended up, not how they got there. They ignore the time involved, the accumulated mistakes, the quiet decisions no one talked about. That creates a constant feeling of being behind, and people who feel behind tend to rush. Rushing rarely helps. Over my experience, I've seen that one of the least popular rules is learning to live with fewer stories to tell. Responsible decisions rarely make good anecdotes. They don't impress in conversation, they don't generate applause, but they create something far more important: continuity. And continuity is what allows you to move through difficult periods without starting over. There's also a rule about limits. People who build something lasting know how far they can go without sacrificing their peace of mind. They don't test their limits constantly. They respect them. Over my life, I've seen many people break not because of big mistakes, but because of small overextensions repeated again and again, always justified as just this once. I learned that saying no often is an essential part of this process. No to opportunities, no to comparison, no to outside pressure. Saying no isn't lack of ambition. It's protection. But it's rarely taught because saying yes sounds braver. The irony is that over time, those who say no more carefully often end up with more real options. There's a calm kind of humor in watching how people deal with these rules. They know in theory that consistency matters, but they behave as if tomorrow depends on today's decision. They say they think long term, but they react to the short term as if it were final. It's not hypocrisy. It's poorly managed anxiety. Over the decades, I've noticed that people who learn to reduce anxiety make better decisions without needing to be smarter, just more patient. And patience doesn't mean inaction. It means choosing when to act. That's very different from reacting to everything. If this is making sense so far, check the pinned comment later. I left something there that connects all of this. In this second part, I wanted to show that these rules aren't magical or exclusive. They're available to anyone willing to accept that progress is rarely exciting, that real growth is usually quiet, and that avoiding predictable mistakes is far more valuable than trying to make spectacular moves. In the final part, I want to close this conversation by bringing these ideas down to a practical, human level. How to live with these rules in a world full of pressure, comparison, and unrealistic expectations, without becoming rigid or bitter, just more aware. Over my life, I've come to understand that applying these silent rules doesn't require extraordinary discipline or a complete personality change. It requires something much simpler and therefore much harder: consistency. Consistency between what you say you believe and what you do when no one is watching, when the noise is loud, when comparison tightens, and when impulse demands an immediate answer. I learned early that people like the idea of stability, but not the path to it. The path is monotonous, repetitive, filled with small decisions that seem insignificant. There's a quiet humor in that. People say they want security, but they grow restless quickly when nothing exciting happens. Yet almost everything solid feels boring while it's being built. One of the most ignored rules I've observed is accepting that discomfort is not a sign of failure. Often, it's just a sign that you're not obeying immediate impulse. When someone begins to act more calmly, the first reaction is often unease. It feels like something is wrong, like you're wasting time. In reality, you're just giving space for reason to appear. Over the decades, I've seen that most people don't need to learn new things about money. They need to unlearn some automatic behaviors. They need to stop reacting to everything. They need to accept that they won't participate in every opportunity, every conversation, every movement. That's not giving up. That's choosing. And conscious choice is one of the clearest signs of maturity. There's also a silent rule about patience that's rarely explained clearly. Patience isn't waiting while doing nothing. Patience is continuing to do the right thing even when there's no immediate reward. It's maintaining good decisions during periods when they seem to be not working. Most people quit exactly there, not because the decision was wrong, but because silence is uncomfortable. I've learned by observing myself and others that impulse has an interesting trait. It always presents itself as moral urgency. It feels like not acting is irresponsible, like waiting is losing. But over time, I realized that many of the worst decisions I've seen were born from that feeling. The funny thing is, almost no one regrets waiting a little longer, but many regret rushing. I like simple images because they stay with you when emotions rise. Impulse is like scratching a mosquito bite. It feels good immediately, but it almost always makes things worse later. In the moment, there's relief. Tension drops. The feeling of doing something is comforting, but then the itch comes back stronger, and the damage is already done. With money, it's very similar. Another rarely taught rule is protecting your peace of mind as part of the process. Decisions made under stress are rarely good decisions. Stress narrows thinking. Over my experience, I've noticed that clarity almost always shows up once urgency disappears. The problem is that many people decide before that happens simply to escape discomfort. There's a kind of recognition humor in all of this. The curious thing is that almost everyone knows what they should do. The problem isn't lack of information. It's excess hope placed in quick decisions. Hope that this time will be different. That time will finally obey urgency. That discomfort won't show up. It almost always does. Over my life, I've seen intelligent people repeat the same mistakes not because they're incapable, but because they never created space between impulse and action. I've also seen ordinary people dramatically improve their trajectory simply because they learned to pause. One more day to think, a night's sleep before deciding, an honest conversation with themselves away from the noise, small rituals, nothing sophisticated, but extremely effective. I also learned that making mistakes is part of the process. The goal was never to eliminate mistakes. The goal is to make the same mistake less often. Once you start recognizing the pattern, comparison, haste, fear of falling behind, you've already taken a huge step. Recognized patterns can be interrupted. Maybe not always, but more often. And over time, that changes everything. There's a final silent rule that ties all the others together. Respect time. Time doesn't reward those who chase everything. It rewards those who can remain consistent without sabotaging themselves. The long term favors people who don't turn every decision into an emotional test. Self-sabotage rarely looks like sabotage in the moment. It looks like opportunity, like urgency, like now or never. Only later, when the noise fades, does the decision reveal its true nature. Over my life, I've learned to value decisions that seem uninteresting to outsiders. They don't make great stories. They don't impress. They don't spark excited conversation, but they accumulate something quiet and powerful: peace of mind. And peace of mind is an underestimated asset. It allows you to think better, sleep better, and decide better when it truly matters. If you take just one thing from this conversation, let it be this: you don't need to chase everything. The world will keep offering opportunities tomorrow. What makes the difference is arriving with clarity, not haste. Time doesn't punish those who wait. It punishes those who insist on reacting. If this content made you reflect, I left something in the pinned comments where I organize exactly how I think about money, decisions, and the long term. It's not about making more. It's about making fewer mistakes. If you want to keep learning with me, subscribe and keep following along.